Do it.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Informed Dissent podcast. It is a news podcast that brings you dispatches from the gender culture wars. I am Ben Appel, and I'm here with Lisa Sellen Davis and Jamie Reed. Cori Cohn will be joining us shortly, hopefully. Eliza Mondegreen is out today. Hi, guys.
Hi.
We're going to talk about the news, what's happened this week briefly, and then we're going to talk about a case that's going on that has kind of opened up a possibility or an opportunity for us to talk about common myths. And so we're assigning ourselves the role of Mythbusters to clarify and bring the facts to give people greater framing for news stories. So anyway, first let's talk about, obviously there's a lot that happened in the news with the Dems and the sports bill, but with Trump's address, I guess we'll start there. Trump addressed both chambers of Congress um, this week. Did you guys watch it?
Yes, every second.
Just the outtakes for me. Just for the pink outfits.
What'd you think?
I'm very pro pink.
You okay? So you were excited about the pink. So it wasn't the meaning behind the pink. You just do enjoy the color. So
I
I
just
did
think
watch it
pink
as
for
well. I
everyone.
watched it the next day. I did make myself watch the full recording, which is very rare for me. I rarely watch those things. Jamie, what are your thoughts on the speech?
Oh, I have been watching these things since I was probably 13 every year religiously. This is like my Super Bowl.
Respect
I
that.
love, I love these addresses. A Democrat got kicked out.
Al Green.
Man who was shaking his cane. There was a lot of booing and noise at the very beginning from the whole Democratic chamber side. It reminded me of the first time one of the Republicans yelled out, "You lie," to Obama. And then
Yeah.
Marjorie Taylor Greene do some similar disruptions. So this is not like that, this is unprecedented. But there was so much in his address about gender,
Hmm.
so many things about the gender culture wars. Well, two of the women in the audience who were there as special guests. One is a volleyball player who was seriously injured by a trans identified male athlete playing volleyball.
Peyton McNabb, right?
Yes. My friend January, Little John, was there as a guest of the second lady, which I had to ask you all, is that person called the second lady? Um, at one point, Trump listed off this whole series of the things that Elon Musk has found being financial kind of terrible things that the government shouldn't be spending money on. One of them is a research study that was utilizing cross-sex hormones in mice. It was a
Mhm.
mice study. Um, I found it very interesting that we are at the animal level study when those things are all supposed to pretty much happen before you roll this out in humans. So that was
Andrew Sullivan brought up that point on Substack. He says, okay, so it turns out that they were, everybody said, oh, this is a myth, this is fake transgenic mice. It's not transgender mice. And it's like, well, actually, it wasn't $8 million, but there was a substantial amount of funds that were put towards testing cross-sex hormones on mice. And then they ended up like euthanizing 80 of them. But Andrew Sullivan brought up this point, like, okay, so it turns out that this is partly true, but also we've been doing these experiments on kids, which is one of the biggest medical scandals in history. So let's think about that for a second.
those.
But let's also, speaking of Mythbusters, there have been lots of studies of cross-sex hormones on other animals in part to understand sex type behavior, to understand the role between testosterone exposure and behavior. Some of those studies were related to cancer research, and mice don't have a gender identity, so they are not necessarily about transgender mice, and they were not as interesting as mouse vaginoplasty would be. I I hope that'll be our image this week. You know,
Hi, Cori. Welcome to the Mouse Vaginoplasty Hour.
welcome to Maths. Anyways, just
I'm sorry, I'm here
say
today.
that a lot of what's going on with attacking research is misunderstood, in that it's perfectly fine to study the effects of cross-sex hormones on animal bodies for lots of reasons. And yes, we went forward with all of these medical interventions without having studies about their effects on humans. But we were going to mention that also there was just an article that came out this morning about the NIH canceling grants to study transgender people. And I want to make 2 points about that. One point is that over the past 7 years, as I've been interviewing academics, many of them told me that even though they wanted to study things like the effect of hormones on sex type behavior or toy preferences among children, et cetera, that they wanted to study sex and behavior, that as time went on, they were forced to include gender identity, that they were in effect forced to be studying trans people even when they didn't want to be, that everything became about trans, that it was a litmus test for getting research money. And part of the creation of this huge cohort is that we released all of these studies. And as we've pointed out before, eventually the point of the studies seemed to be to justify the existence of gender affirming care rather than actually figure out what the effects of any of these interventions were. So I maybe made both points, but forcing people not to study that is not necessarily better than forcing them to study it. And maybe people disagree with that, but this is again part of the correction or overcorrection. And I think most people who are outraged about this do not realize how coerced many academics were into participating in the creation of this trans cohort that then had to be funded to study.
Well, and that's brings up, I mean, that's a really good point, Lisa. And that is what the crux of the argument is about, is whether this funding should go towards this kind of research or just, taking a sledgehammer and smashing it all to bits. The story ends up becoming about it being falsely portrayed in the press. It becomes about, okay, now these folks are saying, oh, this is a myth and this is not, and then it turns out, oh, actually it is funded to, so it becomes a story about, look, the media lies, look, they're telling, and that kind of thing. And it's really jading. It's really, disorienting for people. And it's unfortunate that that happens. But you're right. Bringing it back to this is about funding and a larger issue. And there are things to debate within that. But the news story eventually, because people are dishonest about this and misrepresented and get really carried away.
I mean, I also found it interesting that in England they're battling over funding a puberty blocker study. Again, they already administered puberty blockers for decades, and now they want to suddenly study it, even though the one study they did.
I was going to say they already had a study, and results showed dismal to poor outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
Which they
Just
suppress.
because the NIH doesn't fund something, though, does not mean that the studies or the research can't go forward. It just means you have to find a different funding stream.
Well, that's what the Arcus Foundation and the Pritzker Rothblatt and the
Yes, if they would like to fund those things, then they can fund those studies. I mean, NIH is just taxpayer money. I mean, in some ways. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, so yeah, Trump did mention a lot. What else did he say about gender? He said he mentioned, right.
CEOs, schools. I mean, it was like kind of all of it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it was nice to see January there.
It was.
Yeah. She's a
January Littlejohn was
very
there.
January Littlejohn. She's
One of the perhaps the first person to sue over secret social transition. Cori, did you watch the address or listen to the address?
I'm afraid I didn't.
Me either.
You don't have to be afraid. Do
Well,
not be
we had
afraid.
just gotten back from New Hampshire literally that day, didn't we?
Tuesday.
So
What happened there?
Tell us about it, yeah.
Uh,
Well, you're testifying in New Hampshire about a bill, right?
yes. So
Is it two bills? Is one about
yes.
vasectomies and then the other is about puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones?
Yes, because they already had a bottom surgery, genital surgery ban. So
Got
this
it.
is kind of piecemealing it together, but they're putting it together instead of one broad bill. Cori and I and a young man, sister named Simon Amaya Prince, all went. We had a speaking event the night before and had some TRA protesting our speaking event, which Cori
right.
loves to talk to everybody.
What did you talk to them about? How did it go?
Well, it's pretty typical when I talk to these protesters that we don't tend to sit down and have interesting conversations where we identify our premises and try to find facts that we agree on. That hardly ever happens. At the speaking event the night before testimony, they knew who I was. They had done the Googles, or I guess the grok. They grokked me, but not in fullness, fortunately. That's an in-joke for anybody who has read Stranger in a Strange Land. None of the three of you? Okay, perfect. Somebody in the comments will get it. So they knew who I was, and one of them said, "Your story is not representative." I said, "Well, my story is representative of me, but everybody's entitled to their story." And there was one person that had a sign that says, "Puberty blockers are safe and effective. Ask me how I know." And I had gotten into an exchange where I said, "You are correct to say that I am only here to represent my story, but looking at this person's sign, isn't it the same standard? Isn't it that this person, that she's only representing her view, that you can't take, if you're saying my experiences aren't universal, aren't you saying the same thing about hers?" And they did not like that conundrum.
Lived experience only matters when it's a particular experience.
Well, my viewpoint, and then the next day, there were also some more protesters. And I think it's fair for my opponent to say, you can only represent your own experiences. I think that's true. Every person has their own experiences. But we are not this weird sort of unique program in the universe where our reality is only what we experience. There is a shared mutual reality that is observable and testable and outside of us.
That's kind of the crux of the argument that you were getting, though.
Correct.
It's very philosophical that there's not one truth.
And the principal disagreement about what is or is not truth is whether sex is immutable and innate, or whether it's a matter of experience. And I just don't know how any rational person on any side of this issue can say that sex is relative. I just don't see it.
Yeah, it's hard because of the whole fact of our existence. If indeed that is a fact, I mean, philosophers have been debating that for a long time, but I'm pretty sure we're past I think, therefore I am. So assuming we exist, we did get here because of the meeting of the two reproductive classes that created every human here, even if it happened in a test tube. So
Yeah, so I don't know how you can have a good faith engagement with anybody who will not, like, if somebody said, sure, you're born one sex and you're always that sex, but that doesn't really matter. Okay, fine, like, I can deal with that. Does it matter? Does it not matter? Now we have something that's subjective that we can talk about. Does it matter or not? But if we can't even come to an agreement that sex exists, there is nothing to talk about after that.
Going back to your thought experiment, Cori, are those people now part of the 10? I mean, would you consider them part of the 10, the radicalized
Sure.
10 that you can't convince?
Sure, they showed up to a committee meeting, which means that they are definitely part of the 10. What?
But that belief goes beyond the 10, right? Or no?
What do you mean?
The belief, the irrational belief
Oh.
that sex isn't real, does that extend beyond the 10? And what does that tell us about trying to rationalize with people that are not the most
Yeah.
radicalized 10?
Well, I'm not sure I completely understand, but let me just address that anyway. I don't know if the people who I'm engaging with are on the bubble between I'm never going to change my viewpoint, or maybe I'm just waiting for an opportunity to change my viewpoint. So I don't know for sure that they're the 10. And if they are on the bubble, maybe they can be moved from, this is sort of like Peter Boghossian's epistemology, where if I can move somebody from very certain to moderately certain, maybe that's helpful. I don't have to get anybody to agree with me, but if I can shake them from their certainty just a little bit, maybe I can figure out how to keep building that direction, or I can figure out something that for the next time that I'm engaging with an activist, maybe I can discover a new tactic that I can use to try to move somebody off of their certainty. I don't know. It's worth it to me.
I want to bring this to, or what you're talking about, to our theme of the day of myth busting, because that is it's a belief, a strange new belief that some people are clinging to no matter what. And we can't dislodge, we're talking about how do we dislodge people from their beliefs? And why do some myths persist? And we decided this week that we would talk about that, in part because of this very, very tragic murder of a female identifying as man, going by Sam Nordquist. And the story appears to be that Sam met someone online, was lured to Canandaigua, which is a very nice little town in the Finger Lakes that I've been to a lot, and to a motel where this person was living, and then was tortured for weeks, eventually dying from the torture, probably raped by a group of people. And when you look up the people there, some of them had been convicted for child sexual abuse in the past, bad people. And then to add to the story, it appears that a 7 and 12-year-old were also forced to participate in the torture. And it's a gruesome and horrible story. But we noticed that, for instance, I'm going to read this little passage from The Guardian. We noticed how it was being portrayed in the media, and the immediate emphasis on why it should be a hate crime, and some shock at the prosecutor's decision to not go forward with hate crime sentencing or pursue that. Well, we're not at the sentencing point yet. Anyway, making it a hate crime is a sentencing enhancement, which was designed to, in theory, deter other people from committing hate crimes because they'd get worse sentences. Anyway, some similarities between the deaths of Nordquist and Matthew Shepard, the 21-year-old University of Wyoming student who was brutally attacked, tortured, and left to die while tied to a fence outside Laramie, Wyoming in 1998, are becoming apparent. 2 men were eventually convicted for Shepard's murder, and his death became symbolic of anti-gay hate and helped fuel the LGBTQ plus rights movement. All of that is actually true. 2 men were convicted for his murder, and his death did become symbolic of anti-gay hate. I don't know. I mean, was it part of a TQ plus rights movement? That wasn't going so strongly in 1988.
98,
but,
yeah.
Yes, go ahead, Ben. Now to the part that is a myth. Do you want to talk?
Oh, yeah. Well, so the tragedy of not telling the true story ultimately about the true story is that Matthew was brutally murdered. He died, I think, 6 days after, his injuries in the hospital. I've actually met his parents. I went to a NLGJA.
What's that?
It's a national. It used to stand for National Lesbian and Gay Journalists Association. Now it's like the LGBTQ Journalists Association, but it still has the old acronym. In Palm Springs a number of years ago, I was one of their Connect student participants. It was a great experience. It was also a very eye-opening experience for a number of reasons that I write about in my book. Anyway, it was a week long. A lot of folks from the Times and Wall Street Journal and different places like that. But the Shepards were there, and they were lovely, lovely people, super kind, super nice. And it was before I really knew what ultimately turns out to be the truth, or closest to the truth about this issue, which is that the tragedy of it is that it wasn't necessarily about a gay hate crime, most likely. It was more about a drugs, both Shepard and, one of the men that was convicted of killing him used meth. Um, McKinney and Russell Henderson, those are the names of the Aaron McKinney and Russell Henderson. And McKinney had reportedly even slept with men in the past. It's
With
possible,
Matthew Shepard.
It's possible that they had slept with each other, Matthew Shepard and McKinney. So this wasn't just we're gonna, capture this guy and we're gonna beat him senseless. He was on a bender, McKinney was, and they ran into Matthew Shepard at a bar, and he asked them for a ride, and they planned to rob him of his wallet, and they ended up beating him with a gun and then tying him to a fence post. Um, and then back in town, McKinney ended up assaulting another person. So this was beyond, oh, we're gonna just target this gay guy that we'd never met before. They had a long, substantial history. This is all detailed very well in the book, The Book of Matt by Stephen Jimenez. Is that his name, correct? And it's about the Matthew Shepard story. And he had traveled, which what I love about this story is that he traveled to Laramie, Wyoming to write a play about the Matthew Shepard story. He was so moved by it. He's a gay journalist. And he ended up spending, 13 years there, I believe, because he realized that there was so much more to the story than what was being portrayed in the press. And he ended up getting to the root of what this was. So it's an excellent story. I think at least in the edition I read, Andrew Sullivan writes the introduction. It's just a really good book, so I highly recommend it. But and Jimenez was a producer on the 2020 segment that Glad and other folks tried to completely shut down. We're familiar with this process with how they, reacted to this detransitioner segment on 60 Minutes or a number of years ago. But they, were rapidly trying to get this, silenced and put up, as far as I know, press releases afterwards saying that it was senseless and so on. But the press, activist organizations, they picked up the story after Matthew was killed tragically and said this is a gay hate crime, anti-gay hate crime, and he's going to be our poster child. He's going to be our martyr, and this is going to fuel sympathy for our community so that we can make more legislative gains and have more people on our side, um, because this is the alternative. Support us, or bad men are going to string us to fence posts and beat us senseless. And there
Well,
and
it's
and the,
not just it's not just that the story was made up. Aaron McKinney was probably not very out about his sexuality for one thing, but also he thought that saying this guy came on to me, so I killed him, would get him off the hook. He had assumed that people, the average Wyoming I made that word up, on the jury would
Wyoming.
sympathize with that. And actually it turned out that they didn't, right? Actually,
they
it turned out
panic.
that America was much less homophobic than McKinney had assumed. And so the story wasn't made up by advocacy groups. It was proffered by the murderer. And that guy, the other one, Russell Henderson, seemed to have hardly anything to do with I mean, certainly he let it happen, but he was not nearly as much of a culprit as Aaron McKinney. But even after the cops were saying, nope, it turns out that Matthew Shepard and Aaron McKinney were connected to what seems to be a kind of meth ring in that part of the world that stretches to Denver, that the media didn't correct the story because it activated so many people. First of all, it proved incredibly potent for fundraising. That claiming victimhood just filled the coffers of these gay rights organizations that admittedly many of them had rooted themselves in the AIDS crisis, and there was very little sympathy for, gay cancer, as it was sometimes dismissed. And it also allowed straight Americans and liberals, I guess, to say, no, we're good people and we're not like that. I think it was a preview of what would end up happening with trans kids, of setting people up to be for or against. I am not part of that. I think it was a preview of the kind of polarization around these issues that would come.
Yeah, and the real tragedy of it is that, by framing it this way and by running with that, the real story got lost, right? Which is that meth
Right.
was and still is a major problem issue in especially the gay male community. They
Yes.
call it. They call it, chemsex now. There was just a article. Oh yeah, there was just an article on, I think it was Out or The Advocate, so I'm not sure which one of these that just kind of had like you know, it wasn't framing chemsex as just this normal, enjoyable thing everybody participate, but it was one of these articles that was like, this is how to be safe, and this is, kind of like things to consider, and just the normalization of this is really super sad. And why that's so sad is, for people that don't know people that have struggled with these addictions, I've known so many people. Well, I don't want to say so many people. I've known a number of people that have died from this addiction. I've known so many people, gay men, who struggle with crystal meth addiction. And it's tragic. And that should be the story about what we're talking about. But that's completely lost. Nobody talks about, Matt Shepard was a meth user and this is tragic, and McKinney was too, and this could have contributed to this. It's about this was fueled by anti-gay hate. Jamie?
Yes, I just wanted to follow up working in the HIV realm for years. Yes, we saw very significant, what we would refer to as comorbidities of substance abuse and misuse, and especially in the gay men population. Saw it all the time. Um, but the first thought I had, which I don't know if either Lisa or Ben can help me understand, is when I first heard the Sam Nordquist story, my first thought was, who travels across the country to go to meet somebody they don't know in like a random motel? And are there other elements? I'm wondering, are there drugs involved? Is there trafficking? Like, what are the other elements going on in this? Who, like, you have like seven people living in a motel.
Uh,
Yeah.
Do they take that apart at all?
I haven't seen it. I had actually just written that down, that I wonder if drugs had anything to do with that murder. And
well,
I
so
don't
Sam
really know
came
yet.
from Minnesota, right? And then
Okay.
traveled all that way. It was reported that Sam had had a kind of like an online relationship with
Yeah.
this woman, Precious or Zwaga. And she's one of the seven people that are charged. Second degree murder, two counts of kidnapping, etc. Um, but they had met online and started. I interpreted it as they were having like a romantic relationship, and Sam was eager to meet Precious. This is how I interpreted it. Okay, this is where my brain goes. I thought, oh, here's this very butch
Butch lesbian.
lesbian woman who identifies as trans that met and fell in love with this woman online and is swooning and desperate to meet her and traveled that way to meet her. That's what how I interpreted it. Absolutely, drugs could be involved. Um, I hadn't thought about trafficking, but what I imagine had happened was that this person, perhaps Precious, wasn't or isn't a didn't have these nefarious motives. I have no idea. But there were people that she knew or that were around, and somehow this ended up taking place. I don't know if Sam was necessarily lured there. I have no idea. This is all just speculation, but that's, kind of what my brain was putting together from the reporting. Can I say something real quick too? And I want to just get like personal for a second here, because going back to the Matt Shepard thing, and obviously we'll keep talking about Sam Norquist, but I also want to talk about we can talk about the myth of the trans genocide, that, there's this genocide and murder of everybody's dying and so on. When I was young and when I was coming up gay, and I would hear these statistics about, and maybe Jamie, you can relate about, oh, there's so many homeless gay people, or there's so many murders, everybody hates us, people get bullied, and so on. I'm not kidding you when I say this. I did not know. I was so confused by that, because I thought, how is this? And it was coming from the people that were supposedly advocating for me. And I'm like, how is this supposed to help me? I need hope. Like, I need to feel like I have a future, that there's a possibility. What? I could not get it in my young brain what the benefit was of spreading such a negative message about a life and a way of being, because I desperately needed to, I wanted to grow up and have a future. And the way that it was portrayed to me was that I wouldn't, that whether it be I was going to die of AIDS or whether I was going to get beaten to death or whether, so on and so forth. And, these things are real. Obviously, drug use is real in the community, AIDS is real, but the way that it was framed in terms of, oh, this is somehow helping our cause to spread this. And I just did not realize at the time that the purpose of that, on its
Amazing.
surface is to gain sympathy and to paint folks as victims to, you know, uh, put energy behind their movement. Cori, you're shaking your head as I'm
Yeah.
speaking. What are you thinking?
I'm thinking, Ben, that you went, Jamie, maybe you can relate.
Yeah, that's
I'm
what
sorry. Well, I mean,
Sure.
Jamie is a young gay person.
What the fuck, Ben?
Cori
Well,
was a young gay person at that time too.
well, Cori was a young gay person, but Cori didn't see himself as gay. Cori saw himself
Yeah,
as a
yeah.
straight. It's a little different.
How crazy growing up at the height of the AIDS crisis, living in a house with a bunch of gay men who were doing crank and selling crank. Like,
Oh, I didn't
Tell-
know that
tell
part
us
about
more,
your
tell us
story.
more.
Yeah, what's that
Yeah.
about?
Because I don't know that Ben knew this. And so I actually do agree. Cori's, you probably lined up more than Ben because I
Oh, I
didn't.
have no idea about the story. Continue,
Yes,
Cori,
go.
please.
And I want to know
well,
what it was like for you when you heard the Matt Shepard story, because you were a young man, figuring out your
yeah.
sexual. So
So,
tell us.
so one of the things that composing myself here for a second. The images of the AIDS crisis on TV in the 1990s showed men who were falling apart. Gay cancer, I guess, is a term that I just heard here. But the image of what was considered gay was profoundly disgust-inducing in the late 80s and early 90s. There were still young gay men. I had friends who were gay men. When I got kicked out of my house in my senior year, I went to go live with two of them. One who was an older gay man, older at the time would have been in his early 30s, like more than 10 years older, but he was my friend's partner. And then after I graduated, we all got a house together with a friend who's lesbian and another man who wanted to be gay, but because it was trendy. And they got, like, this was the scene. Like, everyone ended up moving to Seattle or Portland eventually. But I was starting transition at the time. I did not do any drugs. I did not even smoke cigarettes. I was trying to keep myself as clean and pure as possible. But I'm like surrounded by people who are frequently, like every day, taking drugs for recreational purposes, and to the point where they can't even maintain jobs anymore. And of course I'm reacting to that. Of course I'm trying to keep myself out of that space. Every man that I was friends with at the time, even the ones who were not completely in the party scene, ended up contracting HIV. I don't know. That was me, age 17 to 19.
Yeah, that is all brand new information. I had no idea that you even were around gay people or knew gay people or anything like that.
Yeah.
And how did how old were you when Matthew Shepard died, Cori?
I don't know, 18, I guess. What year was it?
98?
98.
98? Oh, no, I would have been a little older. I would have been 23.
I I was 18. Yeah.
Yeah, I would have been 23. Yeah, it was that was several years after Brandon Tina was murdered.
Yes.
And that would have been more salient to me.
Yeah, I actually
But
agree with that.
it's almost identical.
Ben, do you think that Matthew Shepard hit more of the gay male community because it was the other murder that was more impactful
Do you guys remember hearing about Brandon and Tina before, or like a lot in the news? I was not, honestly, I was not familiar with Brandon and Tina
until the movie?
until the movie, until Boys Don't Cry.
What
No,
year did the movie come out?
I knew about it when it was
It
happening.
was like 99, I think, or something like that, or in the
Okay.
90s,
I,
right?
I was friends with the very attractive, at the time, young woman who played her in the short film before it became a feature, and had seen the documentary. And yes, and Brandon Tina was born Tina Brandon, for people who don't know, and was lived in Nebraska, I think, and was attracted to women, and now is presented as a trans man, certainly was living as a trans man, had been diagnosed with gender identity disorder, I think, and was stealth. And it was a different time. So we don't, I'm sure she would be living as a trans man now, but she was also in a place where you could not be gay, and then was discovered and raped, and brutally raped and murdered. And that really probably was a hate crime. And it's kind of fascinating that one is very under the radar, didn't fuel much. Maybe it's because it was trans, not gay, which, was something that we didn't deal with much at the time. And as much as Trump was, parading all of the gender stuff, even the Republicans didn't deal with it for a long time, because there was just a kind of ick factor and confusion around it before they understood that it was massively popular to object to what's been going on with gender in the last 10 or 15 years. So Brandon Tina's murder, an actual hate crime, probably did nothing. Maybe it's because she was a woman. Maybe it's the trans thing. But the Matthew Shepard murder, in part, again, because the murderer did lie about his motivations for killing. And in the book of Matt, there's some sense that he's doing that in part because he does not, that there is some kind of meth ring that he is involved in and does not want to be murdered by those people who run it. But one of the things I notice about the fundraising through victimhood, and in general, this idea that the minute you identify as trans, you're incredibly vulnerable to sue. You could be completely fine. 5 minutes later, you identify as trans, and immediately you're about to kill yourself. And that is why we are so activated. And
that's today's world.
That's today's world. But I think it's that I really relate to that mindset as a person who, until 17 minutes ago, had low self-esteem my whole life. And I fantasized about sympathy. That is what I wanted. Poor Lisa, for all the ways that I struggled. And I did struggle. And I was not functional for a lot of my life, as I've talked about. It's an absolute miracle that I have made it here, and I feel a lot better mentally, not physically. Physically, I feel terrible in this decade of my life, and I don't know if it's partly because of the decade or if it's because leaving the liberal bubble and its messages of victimhood and finding all of you guys and the strength I get by dissenting has made me feel stronger. But claiming power and attention through victimhood, that is the purview of those with low self-esteem who don't think they can get sympathy, attention, or money any other way. It's the last gasp argument that I am a victim, therefore the rest of you have to fall in line. You look skeptical, Cori.
No.
Can I ask the journalists here a question? So
I lived with journalists when I was a teen. Oh, sorry.
so part of what
Tired.
I see as a non-journalist is that why is there not as much worry or concern about when you break the story that the story's right from the start? So it just seems to me that whatever the very first narrative that gets out there in any of these stories is going to be the narrative that you either have to take back later or fix. And I just keep thinking that part of what could be better about reporting on these is just more caution right from the start. We don't know. We don't know 90% of what happened. This is the only thing we know.
Well, let's talk about GLAAD. GLAAD was formed to shape the narrative of reporting on the gay and lesbian community, specifically when
And
it came to
representation
and representation. Well, yeah, representation in film and media, but also helping to shape the narrative because of the way that AIDS and the AIDS crisis was being portrayed at the time, that a lot of people felt that it wasn't being accurately portrayed and that people weren't being helped. And so this organization formed to get better representation, to get more visibility in the media, but also to sway and shape the narrative. And so that when you were talking about what the difference between Brandon Tina and Matthew Shepard was, I mean, absolutely it could have to do with Tina was a female victim. It was also like, 5 years earlier, maybe gay and lesbian and that community was more in the limelight. Also, Matthew, let's talk, he was a pretty, white, blonde young man that could do it. Also, the 90s were the height of gay men were very visible because it was the peak of the AIDS crisis did occur in the 90s in terms of the amount of deaths that were occurring. So that could also be a big part of it. Like, oh, we're going through this tragedy and now we're also being, murdered. This is what happens to us. That's one thing, but GLAAD didn't form that many years prior to, I think maybe 10 years, was it 88? Anyway, whatever it was, not long before Matthew Shepard. And so this is just a continuation of that. I mean, we talk about the NGOs being so wrapped up and intertwined with the Democratic Party and being so, Lior Sapir talks about this a lot, but being really, influential in policy and suing and, ACLU, et cetera. But they have been really, really in the forefront of shaping the narrative. And look what happened. I mean, they had this run-in with the New York Times where it kind of they finally hit a semi-wall a couple years ago when they delivered this letter, from these celebrities that appear to know everything, saying, you have to change your reporting. You're anti-trans, which obviously all of us were like, what? The science is settled. They put on a van outside, and you must hire more trans people, and you must do this with all these list of demands, like it was 2020, and uh, and the New York Times, to their credit, said, sorry, we have different missions. Our mission is to report the news. You're an advocacy organization. We respect what you do, but we have two different goals here. And so we think that we've reported accurately. Now, with us, we would say there was a lot more to the story that New York Times was missing. Um, but yeah, so that's a big part of it, I think, right?
That's part of it, but the other part of it is just the absolute decimation of the entire journalism industry. There are no fact checkers anymore. When I used to write for print, which also paid a living wage, they fact checked the shit out of everything I wrote, and I would get things wrong. And newspapers, reporters are generally responsible for their own fact checking, which is very difficult to do. And now with online publication, there is no fact checking. But I would say, in terms of never correcting the myth of Matthew Shepard and continuing it, I mean, I found when we went back just at the 40 minutes ago and looked at what the Guardian wrote, it didn't actually say it was a hate crime. It said it became a symbol. So do they know? Do they know that it wasn't a hate crime? I don't know. But why is it so hard to dislodge it? I mean, who wants to be the person who goes around, the person Cori talked to in New Hampshire who had a sign that said puberty blockers are safe and effective, asked me how I know. We do not want to go around with a sign that says Matthew Shepard's murder was not a hate crime, ask me how I know, and hand out Stephen Jimenez's book. So
Correct.
It is, as we all know.
Go back to, though, the initial date, like whatever that initial story is that breaks, you can never shake that narrative really out. It'll always be there as that kind of through line. And I think, circling back to Sam Nordquist here, I think that the through line here, the narrative that's going to be in the public, is always going to be that a trans man was brutally tortured and murdered, regardless of the other elements.
You could go look back to last year with a girl called Nex Benedict, right?
Just read my mind. Yeah.
Was she overdosed on pills, right?
Yes, she was found to, I guess the medical examiner determined that she killed herself with pills, yeah.
But the narrative was that she was beaten
and that
in the bathroom, in the school bathroom, and sustained a brain injury and then died later at home.
Right, was murdered by her classmates.
Is media sensationalism and media based on engagement, not advertising. The media has a different relationship with the audience now. I guess maybe people don't like their myths busted. People, Cori, as a person who regularly engages with people who disagree and who thinks about who is movable and who isn't, have you changed people's minds, or have people talk to you about the experience of changing their beliefs, whether you've been part of it or not? What is it like? I mean, because I think people work very hard to not have their beliefs changed?
That's a really good question. And I can't think of an answer off the top of my head, Lisa. I think that when beliefs change, this is what I experience. Often when you change your beliefs, there's a rationale that you have for why your beliefs changed. And then that rationale is part of a story of, it's not how you were really shocked. It was just how you like updated your beliefs. They only changed a little bit. So it might be a 180, but it still only feels like it changed a little bit. So for the people who I've talked to who've thought differently, I'm not sure that the experience for them is like having a radical change of mind. There's one person who I can think of who's a mutual friend of some of ours in New York. And she had a very specific example where she was asking, well, how should we treat trans kids? And I said, well, a trans kid is something that is a label that a child gets because they have gender dysphoria and not because of something that they naturally are. And she said that that sat with her for a minute. She didn't understand it at first. And then the second time she heard it, she was like, oh, we're creating trans kids by labeling them. And then, it's just an updated belief then, right? It changes your conclusions, but it's not that radical of a change. But like subjectively, it's not radical, but it changes everything that you understand afterward.
I don't feel like I've done a 180, because a 180 would be what's happened to my friends who went from liberal to MAGA, and I see them as just as ideological as before. But I think for me, yes, you can see in my early writings how skeptical I am, even though I have neither the knowledge to object to the narrative about trans kids, nor any reason to be suspicious of the New York Times and every medical association and all of my friends who were writing books and making documentaries. And I was so deeply entrenched in the world of people kind of creating the cohort of trans kids. It would have taken, I think it's why it took me so many years to develop enough skepticism to dislodge myself eventually from the bubble. So maybe my beliefs haven't changed that much, but the experience, particularly around the media, because I grew up venerating the New York Times and very, very much wanted to be on staff at the New York Times. I wanted to be on staff at the real estate section, but anyway, that was another life. And then I really, I wrote a bunch of op-eds for the Times and really had wanted to be an opinion writer. And then they froze me out very deliberately, despite many, many, many meetings with editors there and endless 5 years of nonstop trying. So maybe have my beliefs changed? I don't know. The entire infrastructure around me, I can no longer trust. And I think maybe that's what contributes to the staying power of these myths. Because if you realize that Matthew Shepard's death was not a hate crime, but was about drugs and money, that he'd had sex likely with his murderer, who was bisexual, and that Matthew Shepard was not an angel, but was himself involved in possibly at least in using drugs and possibly even dealing them. So much of your worldview collapses, including, oh, the media lied to me for years. There was, the Laramie Project and star-studded movies about it, and the narrative that fueled and filled the coffers of these advocacy organizations that then turned to trans in the 2010s. And I think Jennifer Finney Boylan was the first, if I recall, the first trans GLAAD board member sometime around 2013 or 2014. So maybe we're just clinging to the myths because when we let them go, we have to spin out into outer space. And who wants that? You want to believe in gravity.
I still think that part of what happens when you let go of the myth is there's an element where we all have to come back to accepting some of our own personal responsibility. Because, when you think that Matthew died for this as a hate crime, or that that so much of action, God, I don't know how to say this without coming across like I'm blaming victims, but there are elements of our own personal choices that oftentimes those who actually are the victims of crime do have some element that comes back to your own choice. He was making a choice. He was using drugs. There's some element of, should he have been murdered like that? No. But also, as a parent, do I want my kid to know you have to be responsible for some of your own elements of safety? And the story back again to this woman horribly tortured. I mean, some element of, I got on, whatever mode of transportation she took to travel across the country to go be with people she didn't know. At a certain point, where were the steps along the way where she should have been like, I shouldn't be here anymore. I need to go. Like, could she not have left at any time?
It doesn't sound like she could have left, but I guess we'll find out. And
But you're bringing up valid points. I
we
mean,
won't.
I know what you mean in terms of everybody has, and I guess what makes that really notable now is because it's it's the opposite. People are so encouraged not to take responsibility that it's, I was really stunned by this, to see this around me and how this has happened. You guys know I have a history of drug use. I was a horrible addict, heroin, everything. So I had to get sober and I went to psych wards and it was horrible, but I did it. And it was because I didn't have a choice. I had to do it or I was going to die or end up in jail or permanently institutionalized or whatever. And so that is not a what people endeavor to. It's like there's this, woe is me, and I need special consideration and special arrangements made for me because I am uh, disabled in this way. I mean, for God's sake, all these young people who have disabilities, who are putting disabilities in their Twitter bios and Instagram bios and whatever, to claim membership in some kind of, group of helplessness and victimhood. It's just so different from what I knew. And I initially would judge these folks and say, oh my God, like this is pathetic. But really, it just made, I'd actually less than judging, I would just feel so sad because I knew that that was the last thing that people needed, to get better. It was, you don't build self-esteem in that regard. You have horrible it completely deflates your self-esteem. You build self-esteem by doing esteemable things and by taking care of yourself and making choices that make yourself better, and taking responsibility for yourself. And that it was just something that is just not encouraged in the culture at large. And I think that's a big part of it, right?
Yeah. That that disability narrative really was on display every time we testify, but in New Hampshire it was very much there. And at one point, right towards the beginning, I went and spoke to one of the reps out in the hall because one of the trans identified young people had a service dog that was clearly not trained as a service animal, was big, kind of Labrador, blocking the doorway. And I was just like, I, I'm not the person who's going to be like, oh, get the service dog. That's not really a service dog, out of here. But I was like, can we maybe not block the doorways? Because that's probably a fire hazard. And can this dog be like brought all the way into the room if we're going to let this dog come in? But we do see every time there's a high prevalence of, people with walkers or canes or service animals, like all of these things. Yeah.
All right, we solved all the mysteries.
We did.
We're gonna do more myth busting in future episodes, because a lot of the advances of these narratives we're trying to battle are encased in myths. Of course, most of the people listening to this are either already know or are open to having the myth busted. But I guess my hope is that when they talk to the people who are less open to it, that they'll be able to pass that on, and that when you perpetuate the myth, you don't get to talk about the most important aspects of the story. And that is so true with everything to do with trans kids.
But one of the important elements here too is we saw with Next Benedict, like it was the repetition of Matthew Shepard and in that everybody just needs to slow down when a story first breaks. I just saw on X and so many people just slow down until we see what actually occurred. I think that the White House had put out a statement before we even had the autopsy report.
Because the context of her death is that the sort of legislation that we work on, Jamie, was in the news, and there is an infiltration at these media organizations of people who want to perform social justice activism instead of news reporting. And this all fit together.
Yeah, it's confirmation bias. Right. And it's fuel to say, if you guys keep pushing this legislation, it will lead to violence and death. The thing is that journalism, that it's, as the New York Times actually said to GLAAD, the point is not do no harm, and the point is not hide the truth to protect vulnerable groups.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, knowledge is power.
Knowledge is power, but everybody gets to just assemble whatever knowledge they want now. And hey, what have you guys done that's not about gender before? Let's wrap up and think about something pleasant.
I don't even know. I've been blue, to be honest.
Oh no.
I've been blue. Yeah, but I will say this is my non-gender thing. I've been depressed this week, and I'm like, what is wrong with me? I don't know what's going on. And I'm like, I think it's the state of things. Everybody's just completely at each other's throats. And everything that I feared about the Trump administration is coming to pass. I mean, there's, I am not an economist. I'm not a foreign policy expert and so on. So I don't have the answers. Okay. but I just no longer trust the media to properly frame things for me. So it's really disorienting when no matter everything that happens, it's completely like this is a coup and this is fascism. It doesn't help anybody. It doesn't help anything. And I think that it really does, it's doing a big disservice to the American people too, because people need constancy and they need to feel like even Democrats, especially like Democrats, I don't think it helps even for the people that are really upset about what's going on. I don't think it helps to see their elected leaders looking at this as like the end of the country and the end of everything. I think they need a little bit of hope, and I think that a lot would be it would be really effective for politicians to kind of say, "Hey, it's going to be okay," and this is how we can, talk back against this, and acknowledging when Trump happens to say something that's true or helpful. Um, so I was blue, but then I came across this tweet from Ann Bauer. Shout out to Ann Bauer, who is a writer, and we're mutuals on X. Ann Bauer writer. And Ann Bauer had tweeted something like, and this is like when I was like, why am I so blue? What's going on? And she said, I have been talking to so many conservatives, liberals, centrists, everyone in between, um, and people are really, really down. Um, and it seems like this is a big issue. And in the comments, she wrote, this is really about like, the Democrats rushing so immediately to everything and just like crap on everything that's going on, no matter what it is, because it's Trump and because it's the Republicans. And I'm so tired of that. And it's really hurting my mood. So my non-gender shout out is to Ann Bauer for making me feel less alone with that tweet. That was a long-winded way of bringing everybody down at the end of the episode. And then
Well, also that's a whole other thing because I think there's a real media who cried wolf because that's what they did in 2016. But I think the stakes are much higher now, and there really is some scary shit going on. But we'll discuss that another time.
Okay, well, my non-gendered thing has nothing to do with feelings. It has to do with cheese and crackers.
Mm-hmm.
So in New Hampshire, we went to a very local restaurant, and when you walked in, they had a whole cheese and crackers free station to get you ready for your meal.
Wow.
And for the first time in my entire life, I had a very strange cheese thing, dip. Maybe if anybody lives in the Northeast and can explain to me what I ate, I would love to hear it. It was cottage cheese mixed with Worcestershire, horseradish, and ketchup.
I don't even know what to say about
As a, as a, it's like a, it's like a
sounds
dip the cracker.
like a pimento, or like it sounds like a
that.
pimento
Just
cheese.
sounds like whatever was left in the refrigerator.
I think that's what it was. Somebody hypothesized that this is the Northeast. So at the end of winter, you just eat whatever's left in the refrigerator. But I thought it was lovely and weird. And I love total new experiences. So the cottage cheese, horseradish, Worcestershire ketchup dip. Thank you, New Hampshire, for this bizarre concoction in my mouth.
Cori,
Cori,
do you have anything good? Good. New Hampshire has, speaking of meth, anyway, it's what I think of when I think of New Hampshire, lakes and meth.
I finished an audiobook called Noise, written by the recently deceased Daniel Kahneman, alongside Olivier Soubigny and Cass Sunstein. It is a book about errors in human judgment and ways that those errors can be mitigated. I recommend it if you are interested in thinking about thinking.
and what's it called?
Noise.
By the way, Jamie, that recipe is the common man dip. The common man, at least that's what it looks like online.
Well, that should be the dip of the new centrist political party that will rise from the ashes of our political system.
There you go. What about you,
That's my
Lisa?
recommendation. My recommendation is a viable third party, entirely filled
Oh,
moderate people. Wasn't going to be my recommendation, but I've decided. I've been really trying to get a real draft of my book done, and I have hardly moved or done anything for the 4.5 days. I have barely been outside, and I feel very odd. And I feel like I had a little bit of a humorectomy, but maybe I'll be funny again. Oh God, when I can stop talking about this issue.
One day.
One day, yeah, let's see a new. The Democrats and the Republicans are fucked. Let's have a new party.
Would love it. All right. Thanks to everybody for joining us. And on that note, have a great week, great weekend. Anybody else have anything to say? Cori, are you eager to say a final word?
Yes, this might be the last time I say a final word. Goodbye.